For 20 years, I thought silence would keep me safe. For 20 years, I believed if I stayed quiet, if I made myself smaller, if I just endured, then one day he'd stop. One day he'd see me, love me, respect me. I was wrong. He never stopped. And on the day my husband knelt in court, face pale and trembling, begging the judge for mercy, I felt nothing. No rage, no triumph, no grief. Just a hollow calm that spread through my chest like a quiet tide after a storm. People in the courtroom looked at me like I should be weeping or screaming, but I had already done that. In private, for years, and no one had listened. So now I let silence speak for me. Rick Matthews, decorated former firefighter, community volunteer, loving father, respected neighbor, and behind closed doors, the man who once slammed my head into a cabinet because I overcooked his steak. The man who spat the word useless so often I started hearing it in my dreams. The man who beat the back of my legs with his belt so no one at church would see the bruises. The man who taught our son to flinch at sudden sounds. And now the man trembling before the law facing charges he never imagined would stick. Assault, domestic battery, child endangerment, coercive control, emotional abuse. Years of evidence that I had hidden in fear and gathered in silence. Photographs, videos, medical reports, witness accounts, his own words. I used to stare at the ceiling at night thinking of all the ways I could disappear. How easy it would be to drive into the dark and never come back. But Liam, our son, would always anchor me. He needed me. And as long as Rick held the power, leaving felt more dangerous than staying. I convinced myself that surviving one more day was enough. I stopped dreaming of peace. I started counting minutes. I became a ghost inside my own life. Until one day I found the strength to stop. And when I stopped letting him hurt me, when I started fighting back, not with fists, not with screams, but with truth, I became a woman he could no longer control. I became his reckoning. In that courtroom, as he pleaded and cried, I sat straight, hands folded in my lap. My attorney said later that the judge was moved more by my stillness than any words I could have spoken. I didn't need to scream anymore. I didn't need to prove anything. The bruises had spoken. The footage had spoken. The 20 years of silence had finally screamed loud enough. But you don't get here overnight. You don't go from victim to warrior in a day. There's a whole story behind that moment in court. A story of a girl who just wanted to be loved. A woman who lost herself in the name of loyalty. A mother who chose pain to protect her son. And finally, a survivor who found her voice in the most unexpected place, her own courage. My name is Claire Matthews. I am 38 years old. And this is the story of how I took back my life from the man who broke it one wound at a time. Let me take you back. Before the courtroom. Before the tapes. Before the plan. Back to the first time I believed a lie and called it love. I left one hell only to walk straight into another. I was 18 when I ran away from my mother's house, a place where silence covered everything like thick dust. My stepfather was a man who believed in discipline with his fists, and my mother believed in pretending it wasn't happening. I remember the sound of the belt more than I remember the sound of laughter. I remember the bruises she covered with foundation more than the hugs she never gave. So when I met Rick Matthews, I thought he was the light at the end of that dark hallway. I was 19, he was 35, older, confident, strong. The way he looked at me made me feel like I mattered for the first time in my life. He'd hold my hand in public, open doors for me, call me his girl. When I told him about my childhood, he looked at me with a fire in his eyes and said I would never let anyone hurt you again. I believed him, and maybe he believed himself too. But 6 months after we got married, that promise broke. It didn't snap. It cracked. Subtle. Quiet. The first time he raised his voice, he apologized right after. The first time he slammed the door inches from my face, he brought me flowers the next day. The first time he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark. He cried and told me he was scared of losing me. I mistook fear for passion. I mistook control for love. I mistook danger for devotion. At 21, I gave birth to our son, Liam. Rick was overjoyed. He told me he'd always wanted a son, someone to carry on his name. someone to man up from day one. I remember holding Liam for the first time, his tiny fingers curling around mine. I looked at him and thought, "You'll never go through what I did." I swore it. I meant it. But swearing something and surviving something are two very different things. As Liam grew, Rick's temper did too. He hated when the baby cried too loud, hated when I was tired, hated when I didn't have dinner ready exactly at 6. He told me I was lazy, useless, a bad wife. When I tried to defend myself, he'd raise his hand and sometimes he'd lower it. I learned to avoid his eyes when he was angry. I learned to smile in front of neighbors. I learned to disappear in plain sight. I tried to leave once. Liam was 5. Rick had just smashed a plate on the floor because I bought the wrong kind of cereal. That night after he fell asleep, I packed a small bag and tried to go. I got to the front porch before he caught me. He didn't hit me that night. He sat me down, calm, cold, and told me, "If you leave, you'll never see Liam again. I'll make sure of it, and no one will believe you. Look at me. Look at you. Who do you think they'll side with?" He was right. Or at least I believed he was. He had friends in the police department. He coached Little League. He shook hands at church. I was the tired housewife who always looked a little sad, a little pale, a little off. He knew how to play the hero. I only knew how to survive. From that day on, I stopped thinking about escape. I focused on endurance, on timing laundry to his moods, on keeping Liam quiet when Rick drank too much, on watching every word, every glance, every breath. Every time Rick called me useless, I swallowed it like medicine, bitter, necessary, and killing me slowly. I stopped looking at mirrors. I stopped answering calls from my sister. I stopped writing in my journal after he found it and tore out every page. He didn't just control me, he erased me, and I let it happen, because I thought protecting Liam meant staying, because I thought if I could just be better, he'd be kinder, because I thought love was something you earned by bleeding quietly. But pain has a way of collecting in the body. It stores itself in your bones, in your spine, in your silence, and eventually it grows too big to hide. You start to shake when the door opens. You forget what your own laughter sounds like. You flinch at kindness because you don't know what to do with it. That was my life, day after day, year after year, until the cracks in my silence finally turned into a scream I couldn't hold back anymore, and everything I thought I was protecting began to fall apart. People think monsters look like monsters, that they snarl or stomp or leave claw marks on the walls. But Rick Matthews never raised his voice in public, never lost his temper at family gatherings, never once forgot to hold the door for an elderly neighbor. He knew how to perform goodness. He knew how to weaponize charm. In our quiet Ohio neighborhood, he was the ideal man, a firefighter with a spotless record. The guy who organized holiday barbecues, fixed a neighbor's leaky roof for free, always tipped waiters well. I used to watch how people admired him and wonder if I was the one who was wrong. Maybe I really was too sensitive. Maybe I provoked him. Maybe I needed to try harder. That's how it begins. That slow erosion of self. Rick didn't just hit me with his hands. He hit me with ideas. He planted them so carefully I thought they were my own. You don't need friends. They only fill your head with nonsense. Why are you talking to your sister again? You know she always judges us. You're lucky you have me. No one else would put up with you. Every time I tried to reach outside of our home, he'd pull me back in, always with a smile, always just convincing enough. I stopped calling Janine my best friend since high school after Rick made me feel guilty for laughing too much on the phone. I stopped sending birthday cards to my niece when Rick told me it was a waste of stamps. I stopped attending church because he claimed people looked at me weird and maybe I should lose some weight before going back. Slowly, the walls closed in. He wasn't alone in this. His family was no better. His mother Dolores was cold as stone, always tight-lipped and judging. She once told me a good wife keeps her troubles to herself. You don't want people talking. His father Eugene was quieter but carried the same rigid belief that men ruled the home and women endured. The Matthews family was an ecosystem of control masked in manners and God-fearing language. When I'd visit for holidays, Dolores would scrutinize everything from how I set the table to how I disciplined Liam. "He needs a firmer hand," she once whispered after he spilled juice. Rick was never allowed to be soft. That's why he's strong. I remember clutching my napkin so tightly I tore it in half. Liam was 7 then, sweet, curious, full of life, and I had already begun to see the light in him dim. Every time Rick raised his voice, Liam flinched. Every time he heard a door slam, he'd stop breathing. I saw my son learning fear as a language. Rick believed in raising a man, not a child. He mocked Liam when he cried, called him soft, threatened to send him to military school if he didn't toughen up. I once tried to shield Liam during an argument. Rick pushed me so hard I hit the refrigerator door and cracked my shoulder. That night he brought me ice and said, "I didn't mean to push you that hard. You shouldn't have gotten in the way." That became his refrain. You shouldn't have... fill in the blank. You shouldn't have spoken. You shouldn't have questioned. You shouldn't have forgotten to turn off the porch light. I lived in the land of shouldn't haves. My body memorized pain the way children memorize lullabies. And Rick, with his perfect public image, continued to climb in status while I shrank. I once brought up counseling. He laughed in my face. "You think some stranger's gonna fix your crazy head? Go ahead. See how fast they throw you in a loony bin." He made madness sound like it belonged to me. That was his genius. He never made me feel safe, but he always made me feel responsible. Responsible for his anger. Responsible for Liam's reactions. Responsible for every bruise, every tear, every broken plate. The Matthews legacy was one of silence and obedience. Rick inherited it, and he passed it on brick by toxic brick. I tried to shield Liam, but I wasn't strong enough yet. I still believed survival meant staying invisible. I thought if I could just make myself smaller, Rick wouldn't have anything left to hurt. But monsters don't need a reason, they just need access. And I gave him that every day I stayed, because somewhere deep inside I thought I didn't deserve better. That belief that lie was the root of it all, and it was about to be ripped out. The fights started small, a slammed cabinet here, a harsh word there. But over the years, they grew teeth. They took on new forms. The first time Rick slapped me was because I forgot to record his football game. Just one clean hit across the face like it was mechanical. My cheek burned and my ears rang, but what I remember most was how calm he looked after. Like he'd been waiting to do it and finally had permission. I cried in the bathroom, hand over my mouth, and he never apologized. He just acted like it didn't happen. That became the pattern. If it wasn't acknowledged, it wasn't real. The next week, I started wearing makeup heavier on one side. I told Janine I had an allergic reaction to a new cleanser. The lies came easy after a while. You lie enough and it becomes muscle memory. Rick never hit me where others could see that was his version of kindness. He'd aim for my thighs, my back, my stomach. Once he kicked the back of my knee so hard, I collapsed in the hallway. Liam was 11 and saw it. I'll never forget this sound he made, not a scream, but a short, sharp gasp, like all the air left his lungs at once. Rick turned to him and said, "Go to your room." And he did, quietly, without a word. After that, Liam changed. He stopped bringing friends over. He started stuttering when Rick asked him questions. I tried to comfort him, but I didn't have comfort left in me. I was bleeding invisibly from too many places. Rick's control wasn't just physical, it was total. He monitored my spending, controlled what I wore, criticized my cooking, the way I folded towels, how much time I spent in the shower. He installed a camera in the kitchen for safety, but I knew it was to watch me when he was at work. He checked my phone bills for strange numbers. Once, when I tried to hide a gift Liam made for me for Mother's Day, a painted frame with our photo inside, Rick found it, broke it, and told Liam. She doesn't need reminders of how pathetic this family is. Liam didn't speak to him for 3 days after that. Rick grounded him, took away his video games, threatened to send him to his cousin's house for the summer. "Maybe some real men will teach you how to grow up," he said. I stood by, helpless, afraid that if I intervened, Rick would turn his fists on Liam. And that thought was worse than any bruise. I started to notice things about myself I had never questioned before. I flinched when someone raised their hand, even to wave. I apologized for things that weren't my fault. A broken glass, bad weather, Liam's mood swings. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping, heart racing, unsure if I'd been dreaming or if Rick had slammed something downstairs again. My body was on high alert at all times, a war zone of nerves. One night, after another silent dinner where Rick lectured Liam for chewing too loudly, I found myself staring at the kitchen knife as I washed it, not with any plan, not with any specific thought, just a deep, unspoken ache, a question I didn't dare answer. That scared me more than anything Rick had ever done, because it meant I was slipping away, losing the last fragments of myself. The world outside our home saw none of it. At church, Rick smiled and shook hands. At the grocery store, he kissed my cheek and carried the bags. He volunteered for Liam's school fundraiser and donated to the local animal shelter. He was the American dream in a flannel shirt, and I was the exhausted wife who always seemed a little nervous, a little frail. I couldn't even scream anymore. I had tried, but the walls absorbed it. The world ignored it, and my own heart had grown tired of trying. Until the night Rick raised his hand to Liam. It wasn't a slap. It wasn't an outburst. It was a closed fist. Liam had asked him to lower his voice during an argument, a simple, brave sentence, and Rick punched him in the shoulder hard enough to knock him against the wall. Liam didn't cry. He just looked at me, eyes wide, silent. And then he whispered the words that would change everything. "I wish you were strong enough to leave Mom." I felt the ground shift beneath me, like something ancient inside me had cracked open. I had been beaten, broken, bruised. But nothing hit me harder than my son thinking I wasn't strong. That night I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat at the edge of my bed and stared at the door, knowing it was no longer just Rick's fists I had to answer to. It was the look in my son's eyes. And that was something I could never unsee. The morning after Rick hit Liam, the air in the house felt different. Not quieter, just heavier. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, mechanically pouring cereal into a bowl I knew Liam wouldn't touch. He stayed in his room door shut, not even looking up when I knocked. Rick had already left for work, leaving behind only the echo of violence and the faint stench of stale beer. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cereal going soggy, wondering how many mornings like this I had survived and how many more I was willing to. I could still hear Liam's voice from the night before, low and tired, not angry, but disappointed. "I wish you were strong enough to leave Mom." It wasn't said with blame. It was said with resignation, and that haunted me more than anything else. For years, I had convinced myself that staying was the brave choice, that enduring Rick's fists and his words was somehow noble because it protected Liam from worse. But maybe all I had taught him was that love meant staying silent while being destroyed. That night, while Liam slept, I sat on the edge of the bathtub and looked at the bruises on my legs in the bathroom mirror. They were fading but still there. Ghosts of impact, old as the lies I kept telling myself. I wrapped a towel around my body, opened the linen closet, and reached for a box I had kept hidden for over a decade. Inside were scraps of old journals, photos of bruises I had taken secretly with a disposable camera. A letter I wrote once but never sent to my sister, and a USB drive. That drive held 3 years' worth of documents, emails, and in the past 6 months, videos. I had started recording Rick when I realized no one would believe me without proof. I had hidden a small camera behind a bookend in the living room and one in the corner of the kitchen. I told myself it was paranoia, but maybe it had always been preparation. I watched some of the footage again that night through trembling fingers. Rick screaming at Liam over a B grade on a test. Rick grabbing my arm so hard I cried out. Rick pacing with a belt in his hand, muttering insults under his breath. It made me sick to watch, but I forced myself. Because for the first time in 20 years, I was preparing to do something. Not run, not hide, but act. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over 8 years. Janine. Her voice on the other end was cautious at first. "Claire," she said, like she wasn't sure if it was a prank. I almost hung up, but then I said it. "I need help." There was a pause. Then she said, "Where are you?" "Are you safe?" I told her the truth, all of it. For over an hour, I sat in my car outside the local park while Liam was at school and told her everything. The bruises, the control, the fear, the punch, and she didn't interrupt. She didn't say, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" or "I always suspected." She just listened. Then she said, "You're not alone anymore." Janine wasn't just a friend, she was a survivor. And now she worked as a coordinator for a local nonprofit supporting victims of domestic abuse. She gave me names of lawyers, counselors, and shelters. She told me what to document, what to prepare. She reminded me that leaving safely was more important than leaving quickly. That night, I lay awake next to Rick, listening to the rhythmic rasp of his snoring, and I made a plan. I was done being afraid, but I wasn't going to be reckless. I needed to do this right, not just for me, but for Liam. Over the next 2 weeks, I collected everything. I downloaded video clips, photographed bruises with timestamps, copied financial documents that showed Rick had drained our savings without telling me. I visited a family law attorney in secret and filed paperwork for emergency custody and a restraining order. I opened a private bank account and transferred what little money I could scrape together from the grocery fund Rick gave me in cash each week. I made an emergency bag for Liam and me and hid it in the neighbor's shed with their permission. The day I filed the official complaint was the day Rick screamed at me for overcooking the chicken. He threw the plate, the food splattering across the wall. I looked him in the eye and didn't flinch. That was the last time he raised his voice in that house, because 2 days later he was served. The papers came at 7:45. 5 in the morning, Liam was at school. Rick was eating breakfast when the knock came. He opened the door and 2 officers handed him the envelope. He turned to me, face blank. "What the hell is this?" I stood in the kitchen doorway, my voice steady. "You don't live here anymore." That was the moment the fear left my body. Not because I knew everything would be okay, but because for the first time in 2 decades, I had chosen myself. And I wasn't going back. When Rick was finally out of the house, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was loud, uncomfortable. It filled the walls with memories I had spent years trying to forget. I walked through the rooms like a stranger in someone else's life. Every corner still held the weight of his presence. The dent in the bedroom door, the scratch on the kitchen table from when he threw a glass, the towel rack he ripped off the wall during an argument. I thought I'd feel free. Instead, I felt hollow and terrified because the real war had just begun. Rick was furious. He called from unknown numbers, left voicemails alternating between begging and threatening. One message said he missed us. The next said he'd burn the house down. I showed every one of them to my attorney, who added them to our case file. The restraining order kept him physically away, but he still lived inside my head, and I had to function. Liam needed me to. He was withdrawn, quiet, barely eating. He wouldn't talk about the punch, but I knew it had cracked something deep. Not just in his body, but in his trust. I wanted to fix everything, but I didn't know how. So I focused on what I could control. I got a job, a real one. The local elementary school needed a part-time librarian. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a schedule, a reason to get up, and a tiny paycheck I could call my own. For the first time in years, I stood in a room where I wasn't being watched or judged or hurt. The kids asked innocent questions, smiled easily, trusted without hesitation. It made me want to cry. But I didn't. I just shelved books and breathed and healed a little at a time. Janine checked in almost daily. She helped me apply for state support and introduced me to a counselor who specialized in domestic trauma. Her name was Monica, and in our first session, I told her I didn't know who I was anymore. She said, "That's okay. We'll find out together." It wasn't magic. There were no overnight transformations, but piece by piece, I started rebuilding. I bought myself a new toothbrush, a silly thing, really. But Rick had always bought them in bulk. Same brand, same color. That tiny blue toothbrush on the bathroom counter was the first choice I made for myself in years. Liam started sleeping through the night again. He asked if he could repaint his room. He chose green. We spent a weekend with rollers and drop cloths laughing at our mistakes. That was the first time he hugged me without hesitation. That moment did more for me than any court filing. One afternoon, Monica asked me a question that froze me. "Do you think you were raised to believe abuse was normal?" I didn't answer right away. But the truth settled heavy in my chest. I hadn't just lived with a monster. I had been trained from childhood to accept pain as part of love. My stepfather had taught me that silence was survival. My mother had taught me that speaking up made things worse. Rick had taught me that devotion meant obedience. And now I had to unlearn it all, not just for myself, but for my son. Monica said something I still write on sticky notes to this day. You are not broken. You were wounded, and wounds heal. Meanwhile, Rick was unraveling. His public mask began to crack. When news spread about the restraining order, people who had admired him started pulling away. Rumors turned into whispers, and whispers turned into stories. Women in the neighborhood began sharing their own quiet encounters. The neighbor whose dog Rick kicked, the waitress he screamed at in a diner, the friend who once saw a bruise on my arm and said nothing. She called to apologize, sobbing. The more I spoke out, the more others felt brave enough to. And for the first time, Rick couldn't control the narrative. The truth was growing legs, and it was coming for him. I wasn't the only one healing. I wasn't the only one speaking. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. It was becoming a reckoning. And I was ready. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived like a storm I'd seen on the horizon for years. Only this time I wasn't running from it. I stood in the courthouse hallway dressed in navy slacks and a simple blouse, hair pulled back, hands steady. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was ready. Liam sat beside me, gripping my hand but saying nothing. He was 15 now, taller than me, quiet but strong. He hadn't wanted to come, but he said I need to see it for myself. I need to know it's real. Rick arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a suit I had dry cleaned dozens of times. He looked smaller somehow, sunken like his anger had begun to rot from the inside. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Liam. He just nodded at his lawyer and walked past us like we were strangers. The courtroom wasn't packed, but it felt full. Janine sat in the back. Monica, my counselor, was there too. A few neighbors, a teacher from Liam's school. All of them quiet, present, supportive in ways that mattered more than I could ever say. The prosecution played the videos first. They didn't need to. The judge had already reviewed the evidence, but they wanted the room to feel it, to see it, to hear the truth in surround sound. Rick, yelling, slamming his fist on the kitchen counter, calling me a worthless drain. Grabbing Liam's backpack and throwing it across the room, hurling insults like weapons. I had seen these clips alone. I had cried over them in the dark. But seeing them here in public with a judge watching with my son beside me, it was different. It wasn't shame anymore. It was validation. My testimony came next. I stood and spoke clearly. No dramatics, no embellishment, just facts. 20 years of control silence bruises fear. I told them about the broken plates, the whispered threats the night he punched Liam, the morning I finally called Janine. I didn't cry. My voice cracked once when I said I believed staying made me strong. But I was wrong. Leaving made me strong. Speaking made me strong. Rick's lawyer tried to poke holes. Suggested I had planned this, that I was bitter that I was painting a one-sided story. I stared him in the eye and said, if I were bitter, I'd want revenge. I don't. I want safety. The judge nodded slightly. Rick didn't testify that day. He sat with his eyes fixed on the table, fingers twitching. The court ruled to move forward with formal charges. That afternoon, my attorney filed a civil suit not just for custody, but for damages. Emotional abuse, endangerment, years of unpaid medical costs. I wasn't just asking for freedom. I was asking for accountability. The local news caught wind of the case. They didn't name me, but the headline was clear. Former firefighter faces domestic violence charges after shocking video evidence. Suddenly, the community that once praised Rick was reevaluating. His former co-workers stopped returning his calls. His volunteer committee replaced him quietly. Sponsors dropped out of events he used to lead. And then came the phone call. A woman I didn't know. Soft voice. Shaky. My name is Brenda. I used to date Rick. Years ago. Before you. She had her own stories. He'd shoved her once. Thrown her phone against a wall. Yelled until she couldn't breathe. She had never reported it. She offered to testify now. Said she had emails, old photos. I forwarded everything to my lawyer. More women followed, one by one. tiny lights in the dark. Rick's version of reality was crumbling. The image he had curated for decades, the hero, the provider, the man's man, it was falling apart under the weight of the truth. And all I had done was survive long enough to tell it. 1 month before the trial, Rick's lawyer reached out with an offer, a plea deal, 2 years probation, anger management classes, no admission of guilt. I said no. 2 years of terror, and he wanted 2 years of classes. I didn't want vengeance, but I wanted justice that meant something. That week we went public. I gave a statement to a local journalist. I told my story in my own words with my name. I didn't hide behind anonymity anymore. The article ran with the headline, "She survived 20 years of silence, then made her abuser face the truth." It included parts of my testimony. It included a photo of me and Liam smiling strong, standing outside the courthouse. The piece went viral. And that's when the letters started coming. Dozens, then hundreds, women, men, teenagers, grandparents, survivors, people who had never spoken, people who had lost someone to abuse, people who said, "Your courage gave me mine." I read every single one. Some made me weep. Some made me furious. All of them reminded me why I had chosen to fight. This wasn't just about Rick. This was about every door slammed behind a woman too scared to scream. Every bruise explained away as clumsiness. Every child who flinched when someone raised a voice. The trial was set, and I would take the stand again, not as a victim, but as the woman who refused to stay quiet one more second. I had given Rick 20 years. Now I was taking them back, one truth at a time. The courtroom was fuller than before. Word had spread. The media was careful not to sensationalize, but the story had become a symbol. A woman who endured, a man exposed, a community forced to confront what it had ignored. I sat in the front row with Liam beside me. He wore a button-down shirt and held a pen in his hand, clicking it nervously. I could tell he didn't want to be there, but he also didn't want to miss it. He needed to see the end of it. Rick entered through the side door. No handshakes this time. No confident stride. Just a man, diminished. Face, pale eyes, down hair thinner than I remembered. He glanced at us once. A flicker of something passed across his face. Shame, maybe. Or resentment. But it didn't last. The trial began with procedural motions, then evidence review, videos again. Testimony from Monica, who described the long-term psychological effects of coercive control. Janine took the stand next. She spoke calmly about the phone call, the help she provided, and the visible signs she had ignored for years before that moment. "I didn't know how bad it was," she said, voice trembling. But I suspected. And I didn't ask. That silence cost Claire more than I can say. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. Liam stood. He hadn't planned to testify, but he asked the judge for permission. My heart froze. I wanted to stop him, protect him, but I saw something in his face, a quiet resolve. He spoke clearly. "I used to think my dad was strong," he said, "because he yelled louder than everyone else. But strength isn't in fists. It's in knowing when to stop. It's in admitting you're wrong." He never did either. The courtroom was silent. He stepped down without looking at Rick. That was the end of testimony. Rick's lawyer attempted to question the credibility of witnesses to paint the picture of a broken marriage, not an abusive one, but the videos said otherwise. The bruises said otherwise, my broken shoulder from a fall. Liam's report card comments about anxiety. Our neighbor's statement about late-night yelling. It was a mural of violence piece by piece. When Rick finally took the stand, he looked older than his years. He cleared his throat. He didn't deny the recordings, didn't deny the bruises. But he did something else. He blamed. Said I had provoked him, that I had pushed his buttons, that Liam had disrespected him. The judge asked if he took responsibility. "I didn't always handle things right," he said, "but I was under pressure. That was it. No apology, no remorse. Just justification." The prosecutor leaned in. "Mr. Matthews, are you suggesting that stress gives you the right to assault your wife and son?" Rick hesitated. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." But you did. Silence. The closing arguments echoed with the weight of every witness, every document, every scar. The judge didn't deliberate long. The verdict, guilty. Sentencing would follow, but the decision was clear. Rick Matthews, once the man people trusted with their homes and lives, was now a convicted abuser. As the judge read the verdict, Rick's shoulders slumped. His lawyer leaned over to speak to him, but Rick didn't respond. Just sat there. Still. Numb. A broken monument to the lies he'd lived behind for years. The gavel fell. Court adjourned. It was done. People began filing out. Liam squeezed my hand. I could feel him trembling, but he didn't speak. Outside, reporters gathered, but I said nothing. I had already said enough. I watched as Rick was led away, not in handcuffs, not yet, but escorted. And then it happened. He turned to me. Just for a second. And for the first time in 20 years, I saw him cry. Not rage, not performance, but something raw. A glimpse of the hollow man underneath all that violence. He mouthed something. I couldn't hear it. I didn't want to. Maybe it was sorry. Maybe it was something else. It didn't matter. The time for words had passed. I walked away, head high, shoulders back, each step lighter than the last. That was the end of Rick Matthews. Not the man, but the hold he had on me. The weight he pressed into every breath I took. The fear he carved into every moment of silence. It ended not with screaming, not with fists, but with truth, with witnesses, with consequence, and with my son beside me watching as justice did what it was always meant to do. Hold the powerful accountable, even when the power is inside your own home. The weeks that followed the verdict felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. It wasn't instant peace. There were shadows everywhere, but I could breathe again. The silence in the house no longer held dread. The echoes had softened. The walls no longer seemed to lean inward. I repainted the bedroom, threw away the chair Rick used to sit in, bought new curtains, bright yellow ones, the color of forgiveness. Not for him, for me. Liam was healing too, slowly. He started drawing again, something he hadn't done in years. He let himself be loud, laugh without glancing over his shoulder. The first time I heard him play music out loud in his room, I cried. Not because the song was sad, but because it meant he felt safe. For the first time in years, I felt safe too. My job at the library became permanent, full-time. I took evening courses in trauma-informed education, wanting to do more than shelve books. I wanted to be someone who noticed the signs, the slumped shoulders, the nervous eyes, and did something about it. One day, a student asked if I'd always wanted to be a librarian. I smiled and said no, but I always wanted to help people feel less alone. That was the truth. Rick was sentenced to 5 years in state prison with mandatory counseling and a no-contact order extended indefinitely. I didn't attend the sentencing. I had already witnessed what I needed to. I didn't need to see him again to believe it was over. What mattered more was what began. I started attending a weekly support group. The first time I walked into the room, I felt like an intruder. Women of all ages sat in a circle, stories etched into their faces. I didn't speak the first session. I just listened, and in their words, I heard echoes of my own. The next week, I shared, and by the third, I stayed behind to help clean up chairs. Healing came not in grand gestures, but in tiny moments. Making dinner without fear, laughing during a movie with Liam, sleeping through the night, waking up without dread. There was guilt too, survivor's guilt. The memory of women I knew or read about who didn't get out, who weren't believed, who didn't survive. I carried their stories with me not as weights, but as reminders of why speaking up matters. I was offered the chance to write an op-ed for a national publication. I hesitated, but then I thought of Liam, of every young person learning what love should look like, of every woman staring at a bruise and wondering if it was her fault. I wrote the piece, titled it Useless No More. It wasn't just my story, it was a declaration that we are not what they call us, that silence does not protect us, that healing is possible, that truth is powerful. The article spread quickly. I received letters, Emails, messages from strangers who saw themselves in my words. A woman in her 70s wrote, "I left after 40 years." Your story reminded me why I was right to. A young man wrote, "My mom never got to leave. Thank you for speaking for her." I read every one, responded to as many as I could. I told Liam about them, and he said, "You're helping people now, Mom. That's more than most people ever do." We still had hard days, triggers, panic, but we also had joy, real joy. On Liam's 16th birthday, he asked if he could invite Janine and Monica to his party. Said they were part of our survival team. We made cupcakes and danced in the kitchen. I let myself be silly unguarded. And Liam laughed. Full-bodied eyes, bright laughter. That sound that was worth everything. I no longer defined myself by what I'd endured. I defined myself by what I'd reclaimed. My voice, my safety, my self-respect. I wasn't the same woman Rick had tried to erase. I was someone new, someone who understood that strength isn't about what you survive, it's about what you do with the freedom that follows. I wasn't just living. I was living well, and every day I chose not to look back. There was a moment almost a year after the trial when I found myself back at the park where I had made that first desperate call to Janine. I sat on the same bench, the same worn wood, the same tree overhead now lush with leaves instead of bare from winter. But everything else had changed. I had changed. I looked at my hands no longer trembling, no longer hiding bruises, and realized that I had reclaimed more than just freedom. I had reclaimed ownership of my life. Not perfectly, not without scars, but fully. And that, I think, is what matters most. For 20 years, I lived in a cycle I didn't know how to name. Abuse isn't always loud. It isn't always fists. Sometimes it's control disguised as love, isolation wrapped in concern, threats buried in compliments. For so long, I believed that if I just stayed quiet, stayed small, kept the peace, things would get better. That belief nearly cost me everything, and it cost Liam parts of his childhood I can never return. But the cycle stopped with me. That is my truth. That is my triumph. I tell my story now not because I enjoy reliving it, I don't. There are nights I still wake up sweating, startled by a sound that no longer means danger. But I tell it because somewhere out there is a woman sitting in silence. Maybe she's sitting in her car afraid to go home. Maybe she's brushing her child's hair while hiding a bruise under her sleeve. Maybe she's justifying someone's cruelty because she believes that's what love is supposed to feel like. Maybe she has been called useless so many times she started to believe it. This story is for her, for every person who has been made to feel small, worthless, invisible. You are none of those things. You are not broken. You are not too late. You are not to blame. You are not alone. Leaving doesn't happen all at once. It starts in the quiet moments. A packed bag in the closet, a name saved in your phone, a letter you write and hide, a secret fund of grocery money stashed in your sock drawer. It begins with the terrifying realization that staying is no longer survivable. And then it becomes the slow, brave process of reclaiming your life. I don't pretend to have all the answers. Healing isn't linear. Some days I still feel the echoes of his voice in my mind, but they don't control me anymore. They don't define me. My worth was never his to decide, and neither is yours. Today, Liam is 17. He's thinking about college, about travel, about becoming a social worker. He tells me he wants to help kids like him, kids who've seen too much, felt too afraid to speak. He doesn't flinch anymore. He doesn't hide, and when he laughs, it fills the room. That's what survival looks like. That's what victory sounds like. I don't know what Rick thinks of all this. I don't care. His story ended when mine began again, and mine is still being written in library shelves, in support group circles, in early morning walks through peaceful streets, in every woman who emails me and says I finally left, in every teenager who says thank you for believing me, in every mother who learns that love and pain should never occupy the same sentence. This is how cycles break, not with violence, but with truth, with courage, with someone saying, no more. If you're reading this and see yourself in my past, know this. You can still build a future. You are not your bruises. You are not your silence. You are not their mistake. You are your strength, your voice, your right to peace. The day Rick called me useless, he tried to define my life in one word, but he didn't know that the very thing he used to break me would become the foundation I used to rebuild. He tried to bury me in silence, but I rose in my truth. And now, I speak not for him, not even just for me, but for anyone who's ever waited for permission to be free. You don't need permission. You only need one choice. The choice to begin. That's how freedom starts. That's how power returns. That's how the cycle ends. Right now, with you.